my son's bride, said, "You can watch from the parking lot." So I froze. The wedding funds, in front of everyone. My name is Margaret Walsh, and I'm 52 years old. Right now, I'm sitting in my kitchen in suburban Denver, Colorado, staring at my phone where the wedding vendors are calling nonstop. They want to know why their payments bounced. They want explanations. They want their money. But what they don't understand is that sometimes a mother has to make an impossible choice between enabling toxic behavior and protecting what's left of her dignity. If you're watching this from your living room, wondering how a mother could possibly freeze her own son's wedding funds in front of 200 guests, then buckle up, because this story is going to take you through the most devastating and ultimately liberating 6 months of my life. And if this resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like these need to be heard. I never imagined I'd be the villain in my son's love story. For 28 years, I thought David and I had an unbreakable bond. I was there for every scraped knee, every heartbreak, every triumph. I helped him through college, supported his career choices, and celebrated every milestone. When he told me he'd found the one, I was over the moon. Finally, my boy would have the happiness he deserved. Her name was Brittany Chen, and on paper she was perfect. 26 years old, marketing executive at a prestigious firm downtown. Beautiful in that effortless way that made my son's eyes light up whenever she walked into a room. She had this laugh that could fill a space, this confidence that seemed magnetic. I wanted so desperately to love her, to welcome her into our family with open arms. The first red flag should have been during our initial dinner together at the Capitol Grill last March. David had been nervous all week, wanting everything to be perfect. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, nothing too formal, nothing too casual, just a mother trying to make a good first impression on the woman who might become her daughter-in-law. Brittany arrived 20 minutes late without an apology, her phone buzzing constantly throughout dinner. She answered 2 calls during our appetizers, holding up a finger to silence our conversation while she discussed what sounded like weekend plans with friends. David kept shooting me apologetic looks, but I smiled and nodded, telling myself that young professionals have demanding schedules. But it was the way she looked at me that I couldn't shake, not with curiosity or warmth, but with a calculating coldness that made my stomach tighten. When David mentioned that I'd helped put him through medical school, she'd simply nodded and said, "That's nice," before immediately changing the subject to her own accomplishments. No questions about my life, my work, my interests. I was clearly just an obstacle to be managed. Still, I pushed down my instincts. Love makes us blind, and I was determined to love this woman for my son's sake. David seemed so happy, so completely smitten. Who was I to judge based on one awkward dinner? Maybe she was just nervous too. Maybe I was being overly sensitive, reading too much into small interactions. Over the following months, as their relationship grew more serious, I tried harder. I invited them for Sunday dinners, sent thoughtful texts about her work presentations, remembered her favorite flowers. But with each interaction, the wall between us seemed to grow higher. She would smile at the right moments, say the appropriate things, but there was always this underlying current of barely contained irritation whenever I was around. The engagement announcement came in September. They'd been dating for 10 months, and David called me at work, practically vibrating with excitement through the phone. "Mom," she said, "yes, we're getting married." I could hear the joy in his voice, the pure elation of a man who believed he'd found his perfect match. I should have been thrilled. Instead, I felt this strange, hollow sensation in my chest, like something precious was slipping away from me forever. But I plastered on the biggest smile my face could manage and told him how happy I was, how excited I was to plan the wedding, how welcome Brittany was in our family. That's when everything really started to unravel. The wedding planning began immediately, and that's when Brittany's true colors started bleeding through her carefully maintained facade. David had asked me to contribute financially to the wedding, which I was more than happy to do. My late husband Tom had left me comfortable, and David was our only child. I'd been saving for his wedding day since he was born. The budget conversation happened at their apartment in Capitol Hill, a sleek, modern space that screamed expensive taste. Brittany had prepared a spreadsheet, color-coded, detailed, and ambitious. The total came to $85,000 for a spring wedding at the Denver Botanic Gardens. "This seems quite elaborate," I said carefully, scanning the numbers. "Maybe we could find some areas to trim down." Brittany's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Walsh, this is exactly what we want for our special day. David and I have very specific visions." David squeezed her hand. "Mom, we've been dreaming about this, and you said you wanted to help make it perfect." The guilt hit immediately. Of course I wanted their day to be perfect. I agreed to cover $60,000, the venue, catering, and flowers. They would handle the remaining costs. It felt like a generous contribution, one that would give them the fairy tale wedding they wanted. But that's when the real manipulation began. Within a week, Brittany had appointed herself the primary contact for all the vendors I was paying for. She explained it was more efficient since she was handling the day-to-day planning details. Every decision went through her first. Menu tastings, floral arrangements, ceremony setup. I became a spectator to my own financial contribution. When I tried to express preferences or offer suggestions, she would smile sweetly and say, "That's a wonderful idea, Mrs. Walsh, but we've already decided on something else." She had this way of making me feel simultaneously included and completely powerless. Every conversation left me questioning whether I was being reasonable or just a difficult mother-in-law. The guest list became another battleground. Tom's brother, Uncle Frank, and his wife had been like second parents to David after Tom died. They'd driven from Kansas for every birthday, every graduation, every milestone. But Brittany decided they didn't fit her aesthetic vision. "They're just so rural," she told David when she thought I wasn't listening. "I want our wedding photos to look sophisticated." I was standing in their kitchen, supposedly getting a glass of water, but really listening to this conversation with growing horror. These were people who had loved David unconditionally, who had been there for our family during our darkest moments. But they weren't sophisticated enough for Brittany's Instagram-perfect wedding vision. David's response crushed me even more than her words. Instead of defending his aunt and uncle, he just nodded along. "Yeah, I guess you're right. We want everything to be perfect." Who was this person? Where was the David who used to spend hours listening to Uncle Frank's fishing stories? Where was the boy who cried when Aunt Linda taught him to make Tom's favorite apple pie after the funeral? It was like Brittany had rewired his entire value system in less than a year. But I bit my tongue. I smiled and nodded and told myself that wedding planning stress makes everyone a little crazy. Young couples deserve to have their day exactly how they want it. I could endure a few months of feeling sidelined if it meant David's happiness. The breaking point came during the bridal shower planning. Brittany's mother, Dr. Patricia Chen, was flying in from San Francisco, along with her sister and a few close friends. I offered to host the shower at my house. It's a beautiful Victorian in Highlands that Tom and I had lovingly restored over 20 years. Perfect for entertaining, with gorgeous gardens and plenty of space. Brittany's response was swift and cutting. "Oh, that's so sweet of you to offer, but we've already booked the private dining room at the Four Seasons. My mom has very specific expectations for these events. The implication was clear. My house wasn't good enough. My hospitality wasn't sophisticated enough. I wasn't enough. But the real slap came when I asked about the guest list for the shower. Brittany handed me a beautifully printed invitation, premium cardstock, embossed lettering, clearly expensive. My name appeared at the bottom as a co-host, but I hadn't been consulted on a single detail. The event I was supposedly helping to host was already completely planned without me. I thought we were planning this together, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We are. You're co-hosting. Your name is right there. She pointed to the invitation with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. That night, I called my sister Beth in Portland, needing to voice my growing concerns to someone who would understand. Beth had watched David grow up, had seen how close we'd always been. "Something's wrong, Beth," I whispered into the phone, sitting in my car outside their apartment building. "She's systematically cutting me out of everything, but she's doing it so subtly that I sound crazy when I try to explain it." Beth listened while I detailed the vendor communications, the guest list issues, the shower planning debacle. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Maggie," she said gently, "this sounds like classic isolation behavior. She's creating a wedge between you and David, but she's doing it in ways that make you look like the problem if you complain." The words hit me like a physical blow because I knew she was right. But what could I do? Confront my son and risk pushing him further away? Voice my concerns and confirm Brittany's narrative that I was a difficult, controlling mother-in-law? I felt trapped in a situation where every move I made could be used against me. Winter brought a new level of exclusion that felt calculated and deliberate. Every family tradition that David and I had maintained since Tom's death was suddenly inconvenient or not really Brittany's thing. Our annual Christmas cookie baking session? Brittany had already planned a couple's spa weekend in Aspen, New Year's Day brunch at my house. They were going to her friend's party in Vail. Each cancellation came with a perfectly reasonable excuse and David's apologetic voice on the phone. "You understand, right, Mom? We're trying to balance both families. But somehow, my traditions were always the ones that got sacrificed for balance." The most painful moment came when David called to cancel our monthly dinner tradition, something we'd done religiously since his father died. Every third Saturday, David would come over, and we'd cook Tom's famous chili while sharing stories and catching up on life. It had been our sacred time together for 8 years. "Brittany thinks it's important that we spend more time as a couple right now," he explained, his voice carrying a strange formality that made him sound like a stranger. "You know, really focusing on our relationship before the wedding." I wanted to scream that he'd had 11 months to focus on their relationship, that this one dinner a month wasn't threatening their bond, that I was his mother, not some random person demanding his time. But instead I heard myself saying, "Of course, sweetheart, whatever makes you both happy." The bridal shower at the Four Seasons was a masterclass in public humiliation disguised as polite society. Dr. Patricia Chen arrived like royalty, sweeping into the private dining room in head-to-toe designer everything. She was perfectly pleasant to me. In that way, wealthy people are pleasant to service staff, polite but distant, acknowledging my presence without actually seeing me as a person. I'd brought a carefully chosen gift, a vintage silver jewelry box that had belonged to Tom's grandmother, engraved with Brittany's new initials. It was a family heirloom, something I'd been saving for David's future wife. I thought it was the perfect gesture, welcoming her into our family history. Brittany opened it in front of everyone, smiled appropriately, and said all the right words. But later, when she thought I was in the bathroom, I heard her whisper to one of her bridesmaids, "It's so tarnished. I'll probably just donate it somewhere." Standing in that bathroom stall, Listening to her dismiss a piece of my family's history like it was worthless garage sale junk, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just about wedding planning stress or personality conflicts. This was about a fundamental lack of respect for my family, my history, and my relationship with my son. But the worst was yet to come. The shower games included the traditional "How well do you know the groom?" quiz, question after question about David's favorites, his childhood, his dreams. I should have been the expert. I was his mother. But as Brittany's friends shouted out answers, I realized how much I no longer knew about my son's current life. His favorite restaurant? I guessed the Italian place we'd always loved, but apparently it was some trendy sushi spot downtown. His biggest fear? I thought it was heights, like when he was little, but now it was not living up to his potential. His dream vacation? Not the fishing trip to Montana he'd talked about since college, but wine tasting in Tuscany. When had he changed so completely? When had his dreams shifted from things we'd discussed together to aspirations that sounded like they'd been lifted from lifestyle magazines? I sat there, getting answer after answer wrong about my own son, while his fiancé's friends laughed and shared knowing looks. Dr. Chen won the game, of course. She knew all the right answers about David's new preferences, his evolving tastes, his updated ambitions. I came in last, a humiliating third behind even Brittany's college roommate, who'd only met David a handful of times. "Don't worry, Mrs. Walsh," Brittany said with that perfectly practiced smile. "People change when they find the right person. David's really growing into who he's meant to be." The implication was clear. I'd been holding him back from becoming his authentic self. She was helping him evolve beyond the small-town values and simple pleasures I'd raised him with. I was the past. She was his sophisticated future. The drive home from that shower was the longest 30 minutes of my life. I kept replaying every interaction, every subtle slight, every moment where I'd felt like an outsider at an event supposedly honoring my son's upcoming marriage. The city lights blurred through my tears as I finally admitted to myself what I'd been denying for months. My son was lost to me. Not dead, not moved away, but somehow transformed into someone I no longer recognized. And the woman he was about to marry was the architect of that transformation. That night, I did something I hadn't done since Tom's funeral. I opened a bottle of wine and drank it while looking through photo albums of David growing up. Pictures of camping trips and school plays and birthday parties. Images of a boy who loved simple things, who valued family above all else, who used to tell me I was his best friend in the whole world. At some point during that wine-soaked journey through memory lane, I made a decision. I couldn't compete with Brittany's vision of who David should become. I couldn't force him to remember the values I'd tried to instill, but I could stop enabling a relationship built on my exclusion and emotional manipulation. I could stop being complicit in my own erasure from my son's life. Spring arrived with an intensity that felt ominous, like nature itself was holding its breath for what was coming. The wedding was 6 weeks away, and the vendors I was paying for had been given explicit instructions by Brittany to communicate only through her. When I called the florist to discuss a small change to the centerpieces, they politely informed me that Miss Chen had requested all modifications go through her first. "But I'm the one paying for the flowers," I said, confusion evident in my voice. "Yes, Mom, but she's listed as the primary contact. Would you like me to have her call you?" This pattern repeated with every vendor, the caterer, the musicians, even the venue coordinator. Despite funding $60,000 of their wedding, I had been systematically removed from any actual decision-making power. I was financing a wedding I had no voice in planning. When I brought this up to David during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations, his response was dismissive. Mom, Brittany's just really organized. She wants to make sure nothing falls through the cracks. Isn't it nice that you don't have to worry about all the details? Nice. As if being excluded from my son's wedding planning was a favor they were doing for me. The final dress fitting was when I truly understood the depth of my exile. I'd assumed I would be invited. What mother isn't present for her future daughter-in-law's final dress fitting? But the appointment came and went without a word. I only found out it had happened when Brittany posted a series of Instagram stories from the bridal salon, surrounded by her mother, sister, and bridesmaids. Not one photo included me. Not one story mentioned the woman whose money was paying for a significant portion of the celebration. I was erased from the narrative entirely. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I created a fake Instagram account and spent hours scrolling through Brittany's posts about the wedding. What I found there broke my heart in ways I hadn't anticipated. Months of wedding planning content, vendor visits, menu tastings, flower selection, venue tours, every significant moment beautifully documented and shared with her followers, and in not one single photo, in not one caption, was there any acknowledgement of my existence or contribution. The narrative she'd crafted was of a woman planning her dream wedding with the support of her amazing fiancé and loving mother. Dr. Chen appeared in dozens of photos. David's friends were tagged and celebrated. Even Brittany's college roommates were prominently featured. But I was a ghost in the story of my own son's wedding. The comments on her posts were revealing in their own way. Friends praising her independence, her vision, her ability to create such a beautiful celebration, all on her own. Colleagues admiring her organization skills and attention to detail. Family members expressing excitement about welcoming David into their family. One comment from Dr. Chen particularly stung. So proud of my daughter for creating such a sophisticated celebration. David is lucky to be marrying into such an elegant family tradition. The implication was clear. David was marrying up. He was joining their family, not the other way around, and certainly not joining a family that included someone like me. But it was Brittany's response to that comment that truly revealed her character. Thanks, Mom. David's really learning to appreciate the finer things in life. It's been wonderful watching him evolve, as if everything he'd been before meeting her was some primitive version that needed upgrading. I screenshotted that exchange, though I'm not sure why. Maybe I needed proof that I wasn't imagining the subtle cruelty. Maybe I wanted evidence of what was really happening to my son. Or maybe I was just documenting my own heartbreak for future reference. The bachelor and bachelorette parties were planned for the same weekend in late April. David's friends were taking him to Las Vegas for 3 days of golf and gambling. Brittany was having a sophisticated celebration in Napa Valley with wine tastings and spa treatments. I wasn't invited to either, of course. Not that I expected to be included in the bachelor party, but traditionally, mothers are at least considered for bachelorette celebrations, especially mothers who are financially contributing to the wedding. When I casually asked David about it, he seemed genuinely surprised by my expectation. "Oh, Mom, I don't think bachelorette parties usually include... it's more of a friends thing." The pause before he dismissed me was telling. He'd started to say something else, probably something about age or generational differences, but caught himself. Still, the message was clear. I didn't fit the demographic of sophisticated women Brittany wanted to celebrate with. That weekend, while they partied in expensive locations with their respective friend groups, I sat in my garden planting flowers for a summer I wasn't sure I'd enjoy. My phone remained silent except for vendor calls asking about payment schedules and final confirmations. It struck me that I knew more about the wedding logistics than I did about my son's current life. I could tell you exactly which appetizers were being served and how many roses would be in each centerpiece, but I couldn't tell you what David was excited about in his career or what he and Brittany talked about on quiet evenings at home. The financial dynamic had created an especially twisted situation. I was funding their dream celebration while being excluded from the joy of planning it. I was paying for a party that was actively designed to diminish my role in my son's life. Sunday afternoon, they both returned from their respective trips, tanned and happy and full of stories I wasn't invited to hear. David called to thank me again for making the wedding possible with my contribution, but his voice carried that same formal distance that had become our new normal. "We really appreciate everything you're doing, Mom. Brittany and I know how lucky we are to have your support." Support. As if I was a generous donor rather than his mother. As if my investment in his happiness was charity rather than love. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my financial advisor and asked about the logistics of freezing payments to the wedding vendors, not canceling them, just temporarily stopping the flow of money until certain conditions were met. "What kind of conditions?" he asked. I wasn't sure yet. I just knew that something fundamental had to change before I could continue financing my own exclusion from my son's life. The final guest list was revealed 3 weeks before the wedding, and that's when I discovered the true extent of Brittany's manipulation. Not only had she successfully eliminated Uncle Frank and Aunt Linda from the invitation list, but she'd also forgotten to include my closest friends, women who had been like family to David since he was born. Sarah Martinez had been my best friend since college. She'd held David as a newborn, babysat him countless times, attended every birthday party and graduation. She was practically his aunt. But according to Brittany, they were trying to keep things intimate and could only invite people who were currently active in their lives. Currently active, as if decades of love and history could be dismissed because these relationships weren't part of Brittany's social media aesthetic. When I tried to discuss this with David, he actually seemed annoyed by my concern. "Mom, we can't invite everyone. Brittany's been really stressed about the numbers. Can't you just understand that we have to make tough choices?" Tough choices. Choosing between his mother's lifelong friends and his fiancé's yoga instructor apparently qualified as a tough choice in David's new value system. But the absolute breaking point came during what should have been a simple conversation about seating arrangements. I called Brittany directly, hoping to discuss where Tom's family members would be seated. It was a small request. I just wanted to make sure they felt welcome and included. Her response was delivered in that sweet, condescending tone she'd perfected over the past year. "Oh, Mrs. Walsh, we've actually decided to seat you with my family's friends from San Francisco. They're such interesting people. A tech entrepreneur and his wife who runs an art gallery. I thought you'd enjoy meeting new people rather than just sitting with David's side of the family." The implications were staggering. Not only was I being separated from my own family members, but I was being treated like a social experiment, like someone who needed to be managed and contained rather than honored as the groom's mother. "I'd prefer to sit with Tom's brother and his wife," I said firmly. "Their family." There was a pause that lasted just long enough to feel deliberate. "Well, the thing is, we've already finalized the seating chart. And frankly, Mrs. Walsh, I think you'll find Dr. Chen's friends much more compatible with your interests." Compatible. The word hit me like a slap. She was essentially saying that Tom's family, hardworking, honest people who had loved David unconditionally, weren't sophisticated enough for her wedding vision, and by extension, neither was I. But what came next was the moment that changed everything. Actually, Brittany continued, her voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before, since we're talking about arrangements, there's something else we need to discuss. The ceremony itself is going to be quite intimate, and we're limiting seating to immediate family only. I hope you understand. My heart stopped. What exactly are you saying? Well, with David's father being deceased, you're really the only family he has. And my side has quite a few people. So we were thinking maybe you could watch the ceremony from outside. There's a lovely garden area where you can still see everything. And honestly, the outdoor space might be more comfortable for you anyway. The words hung in the air like poison gas, slowly suffocating my ability to breathe. She was asking me to watch my son's wedding from outside, like a stranger, like someone who didn't deserve a seat at the most important moment of his life. You want me to watch from outside? My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. Oh, not outside exactly. More like from the garden terrace. You'll still be able to see everything perfectly. And honestly, Mrs. Walsh, with your photography hobby, you might get better pictures from back there anyway. She was trying to spin my exile as a favor, as if standing in a garden while my son got married was some kind of privilege she was granting me. Brittany, I said, my voice shaking with controlled rage, I am David's mother. I have been planning and paying for this wedding. I will not be watching from any garden terrace. Her response was swift and sharp, dropping all pretense of sweetness. Mrs. Walsh, I think you need to remember that this is our wedding, not yours. David and I have made these decisions together, and if you can't respect our choices, then maybe you shouldn't come at all. The line went dead. She had actually hung up on me after suggesting I skip my own son's wedding. I sat in my kitchen, staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 5 minutes, I'd been told I wasn't sophisticated enough to sit with my own family, that I should watch the ceremony from outside like an uninvited guest, and that I could skip the wedding entirely if I didn't like the arrangements. The woman I was financially supporting had just banished me from my son's wedding. My hands were shaking as I dialed David's number. When he answered, I could hear Brittany's voice in the background, already spinning her version of our conversation. David, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, we need to talk. Right now. Mom, Brittany told me you got upset about the seating arrangements. Look, I know it's not ideal, but she wants me to watch your wedding from outside. Silence. Long, awful silence that told me everything I needed to know. David, did you know about this? When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and defensive. Mom, it's not like that. There's just limited space and you thought I should watch your wedding from a garden terrace? You're being dramatic. You'll still be able to see everything perfectly fine. In that moment, listening to my son defend a plan to exile me from his wedding ceremony, I realized that the David I had raised and loved was truly gone. The man on the phone was a stranger who valued his fiancée's comfort more than his mother's dignity. I see, I said quietly. And who exactly gets to sit inside while I'm watching from the parking lot? It's not the parking lot, Mom. And it's just Brittany's family has a lot of important people coming and I hung up. For the first time in his 28 years of life, I hung up on my son. That night, I opened my laptop and drafted an email to every single vendor I was paying for. The subject line was simple: payment authorization changes required. It was time to remind everyone exactly who was funding this celebration of my own humiliation. The first vendor to call was Patricia from Elegance Catering, and the panic in her voice was immediately apparent. "Mrs. Walsh, I received your email about requiring written authorization for all future charges to your account. Can you clarify what exactly you need from us?" I'd spent the entire night crafting my response, and I delivered it with newfound clarity. "From this point forward, any charges to my account must be approved by me personally in writing, with 48 hours advance notice. No exceptions. But Mrs. Walsh, we have final menu confirmations due this week, and Miss Chen has been handling all those details. Then Miss Chen can contact me directly to discuss any charges to my account." The silence on the other end told me Patricia understood the implications perfectly. After 11 months of being cut out of communication, I was reasserting my position as the person actually paying the bills. By noon, my phone was ringing constantly. The florist, the musicians, the venue coordinator, everyone suddenly needed to speak with me directly about final details and payment schedules. Apparently, when money talks, people listen very carefully. Brittany called at 2:47 p.m., and her voice had lost all pretense of sweetness. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "I'm managing my financial contributions to your wedding," I replied calmly. "Something I should have been doing all along. You can't just change the payment structure 3 weeks before the wedding." "Actually, I can. It's my money." The pause that followed was filled with fury barely held in check. "David is going to hear about this." "I'm sure he will. Please have him call me when he's ready to discuss the new arrangement." She hung up without another word, but within an hour David was at my front door. I'd been expecting this confrontation, but seeing my son standing on my porch with genuine anger in his eyes still broke my heart. "Mom, what the hell are you doing?" I invited him in, but he remained standing in my entryway, arms crossed, looking at me like I was a stranger who'd kidnapped his real mother. "I'm requiring approval for expenses I'm paying for," I said simply. "That seems reasonable." "You're sabotaging our wedding 3 weeks before the date." "Am I? Or am I asking for basic respect and inclusion in decisions about money I'm spending?" His face was red with frustration, and I could see Brittany's talking points in every gesture. "You're being manipulative. You're trying to control our wedding with money." The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. I was using financial leverage to force a conversation that should have happened naturally months ago. But I was also protecting myself from complete erasure. "David, sit down, please." He remained standing, but something in my tone must have reached him because his defensive posture softened slightly. "I need you to understand something," I continued. "For almost a year, I've been systematically excluded from every aspect of your wedding planning while being expected to pay for it. I've watched you change into someone I don't recognize. I've been uninvited from family traditions, dismissed from important conversations, and yesterday, your fiancé suggested I watch your wedding from outside because there isn't room for me inside." His face went pale. "She didn't say that. She absolutely said that. She said I could watch from the garden terrace because it might be more comfortable for me. Like I'm some elderly relative who needs special accommodation rather than your mother." David sank into my living room chair, and for the first time in months, he looked like the boy I'd raised, confused, hurt, and maybe beginning to see the situation from a different perspective. "That's not, there are space limitations." "Whose space limitations?" "Brittany's family friends who are more important than Uncle Frank and Aunt Linda. Dr. Chen's colleagues who deserve seats while my lifelong friends don't even get invitations." I could see him processing this information, perhaps for the first time, considering the pattern of exclusions rather than accepting each individual decision as reasonable. "Mom, I didn't realize." "Of course you didn't realize, because every conversation about the wedding goes through Brittany first. Every decision is presented to you as already made. You've been isolated from your own family so gradually that you didn't notice it happening. We sat in silence for several minutes while David stared at his hands. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "What do you want me to do?" It was the first time in almost a year that he'd asked for my opinion about anything related to his relationship or wedding. "I want you to think about whether the woman you're marrying respects your family enough to include them in your life. I want you to consider whether someone who would ask your mother to watch your wedding from outside is someone who truly loves and honors you." "But she does love me. I know she does." "David, love isn't just about how someone treats you when you're alone together. It's about how they treat the people you care about. It's about whether they add to your life or subtract from it." He was quiet for a long time, and I could almost see him reviewing the past year through this new lens: the cancelled dinners, the eliminated family members, the gradual erosion of every relationship that predated Brittany. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now, we have an honest conversation about what kind of wedding you want. One that celebrates your love while honoring the people who have loved you your entire life, or one that erases your history to accommodate someone else's vision of who you should become." David left that evening without making any commitments, but something fundamental had shifted in our conversation. For the first time in months, he'd listened to me not as a difficult mother-in-law to be managed, but as someone whose perspective might have value. The next morning, I received a text from Brittany. "We need to meet. Today." It was time for the real confrontation to begin. Brittany suggested meeting at a coffee shop in Cherry Creek, neutral territory where she could maintain her public composure while we discussed what she clearly saw as my rebellion against her authority. I arrived first and chose a table in the back corner, away from the lunch crowd, but still visible enough that she couldn't create a scene without witnesses. She walked in looking like she was heading to a business meeting. Perfectly tailored blazer, designer handbag, confidence radiating from every step. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightness around her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept well since our conversation about payment authorizations. "Mrs. Walsh," she said, sitting across from me without ordering anything, "I think we need to clear the air." "I agree. Let's start with why you think it's appropriate to exclude me from my son's wedding ceremony." Her composure faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "I never said you were excluded. I offered alternative seating that might be more comfortable. Alternative seating in the garden terrace, outside, away from the ceremony. The garden terrace has a beautiful view." "Stop." My voice was sharper than I'd intended, but I was done with her gaslighting. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you weren't trying to exile me from the ceremony. Own what you said." For the first time since I'd known her, Brittany's mask slipped completely. The sweet, accommodating facade disappeared, replaced by cold calculation and barely controlled anger. "Fine. You want honesty? Here's honesty. This wedding is about David and me starting our life together. It's about our future, not about catering to his past. And frankly, Mrs. Walsh, you represent a version of David that I'm helping him outgrow." The words hung between us like a declaration of war. She was admitting, finally, that she saw me as an obstacle to be eliminated rather than a family member to be embraced. "Outgrow?" I kept my voice level despite the rage building in my chest. "David has so much potential. He's brilliant and ambitious and capable of so much more than he ever imagined. But he's been held back by small-town thinking and limited expectations. I'm helping him see what's possible when you aim higher." Small-town thinking. You mean the values that taught him to be kind, loyal, and grounded? I mean the mentality that says settling for comfortable is enough, that family dinner traditions matter more than career networking, that choosing the Italian restaurant you've always gone to is better than exploring new experiences. Each word felt like a calculated insult, designed to diminish everything I'd taught David about the importance of relationships, traditions, and staying connected to your roots. So this is about more than just wedding planning, I said. This is about remaking my son into someone you find more acceptable. This is about David becoming the best version of himself. And sometimes that means leaving behind people and patterns that no longer serve his growth. The clinical way she discussed erasing me from David's life was breathtaking in its cruelty. I wasn't a person to her. I was a limiting factor in her renovation project. And where exactly do I fit in this best version of David's life? Brittany leaned forward slightly, and I could see she'd been planning this conversation for a long time. That depends entirely on whether you can adapt to the new dynamic. David loves you, but he loves me more. He's chosen his future, and that future is with me. You can either find a way to support that choice gracefully, or you can continue being an obstacle that he'll eventually have to remove completely. The ultimatum was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, clean, decisive, and designed to cause maximum damage. So, my options are to accept whatever role you assign me in my son's life, or lose him entirely. Your words, not mine. But essentially, yes, I stared at this woman who had systematically dismantled my relationship with my son while maintaining a facade of sweetness and accommodation. She'd played a masterful game of manipulation, always appearing reasonable while gradually isolating David from everyone who had loved him before her. And the money I'm contributing to the wedding? That's your choice to make. But understand that withdrawing financial support will be seen as exactly the kind of manipulative, controlling behavior that David is learning to recognize and distance himself from. She had me trapped in a perfect catch-22. Continue funding the wedding, and I'd be paying for my own humiliation and exile. Withdraw support, and I'd be painted as the vindictive mother-in-law who tried to sabotage their happiness out of spite. You've thought this through very carefully, I said. I've thought through what's best for David, and what's best for David is building a life with someone who supports his growth and ambitions, rather than trying to keep him tethered to a past that's holding him back. No, and you genuinely believe that cutting him off from his family and history is helping him grow. I believe that helping him develop new relationships and experiences is expanding his world in ways that matter. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the essential dynamic was established. Brittany saw herself as David's savior, rescuing him from the limitations of his upbringing. I was the antagonist in her story, the small-minded mother who couldn't see that her son deserved better than what she'd given him. When she left, I sat in that coffee shop for another hour, processing what had just happened. The woman my son was about to marry had essentially told me that my relationship with him was conditional on my acceptance of whatever diminished role she deemed appropriate. But in revealing her true thoughts and motivations, Brittany had also given me something valuable: clarity about what I was really fighting for. This wasn't just about wedding planning or seating arrangements. This was about whether David would spend the rest of his life with someone who saw his family as obstacles to be managed rather than relationships to be cherished. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I called the 3 most important vendors: catering, florals, and venue coordination, and scheduled individual meetings for the following day. It was time to have some very direct conversations about exactly what my $60,000 was and wasn't going to purchase. If Brittany wanted to play hardball, she was about to discover that she'd chosen the wrong opponent. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and beautiful, Exactly the kind of perfect May day that wedding planners dream about. Cherry blossoms were in full bloom at the Denver Botanic Gardens. The sky was cloudless, and there wasn't a hint of the Colorado wind that could make outdoor ceremonies challenging. I'd been awake since 4 a.m., not from nervousness, but from a strange sense of calm resolution. After 2 weeks of increasingly desperate phone calls from Brittany, David, and Dr. Chen, I knew exactly what was going to happen today. The question wasn't whether I would follow through with my plan. It was whether my son would finally see his fiancée's true character when her perfect day started to crumble. My phone had been buzzing constantly for the past week. David called daily, his voice swinging between pleading and anger as he tried to understand why I was doing this to them. Brittany's communications had become increasingly frantic, though she still tried to maintain her superior tone, even while essentially begging me to release the vendor payments. Dr. Chen had even flown in early to join the intervention efforts, calling me from her hotel at the Four Seasons to explain how disappointed she was in my behavior. Apparently, sabotaging her daughter's perfect day was evidence of deep character flaws that explained why David needed to distance himself from my influence. But the most heartbreaking call had come from Uncle Frank. David had actually called his uncle, the man Brittany had deemed too rural for the wedding guest list, to ask him to talk sense into me. "Maggie, sweetheart," Frank had said in his gentle Kansas drawl, "David says you're upset about some wedding planning details. Can't you work this out with the kids?" The fact that David was reaching out to family members he'd been ignoring for months, asking them to mediate a conflict they hadn't even been invited to witness, told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. Brittany's perfect control was slipping, and David was scrambling to manage a situation he didn't fully understand. I arrived at the venue at 2 p.m., 3 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The gardens were already bustling with vendor activity, florists arranging centerpieces, caterers setting up the reception space, musicians doing sound checks. Everything looked exactly as expensive and elegant as Brittany had envisioned. Patricia from Elegance Catering spotted me first and hurried over with a worried expression. "Mrs. Walsh, thank goodness you're here. We've been trying to reach you about the final payment authorization. We have staff scheduled to serve dinner at 6 p.m., but without your approval." "Patricia, let's have that conversation in a few minutes. First, I'd like to see how everything is set up." I walked through the reception area slowly, taking in every detail of the celebration I'd funded, but been excluded from planning. The flowers were stunning, white roses and peonies with touches of eucalyptus, exactly what Brittany had wanted. The tables were set with elegant linens and crystal glasses that caught the afternoon sunlight perfectly. It was beautiful. It was sophisticated. It was everything a bride could want for her special day, and it was being paid for by the woman the bride had tried to exile to the garden terrace. At 2:30, I spotted Dr. Chen arriving with what looked like a small army of relatives. They were impeccably dressed, clearly important people accustomed to elegant events. These were the guests whose presence was so crucial that my son's actual family had been eliminated from the invitation list. Brittany arrived 15 minutes later in a luxury SUV, accompanied by her bridesmaids and an entourage of beauty professionals. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in her posture. She kept checking her phone and speaking in sharp, urgent tones to her wedding planner. David pulled up shortly after, and my heart clenched at the sight of him. He looked handsome in his tuxedo, but exhausted and stressed in a way that had nothing to do with normal wedding day nerves. When he spotted me near the ceremony space, he immediately walked over. "Mom, please, whatever you're planning, can we just talk about this? Today isn't the day for—" "David," I interrupted gently. Today is exactly the day for this conversation. Because today is when you're making the most important commitment of your life, and you need to understand who you're making it to. His face cycled through confusion, frustration, and something that might have been fear. What are you talking about? Before I could answer, Brittany appeared at his side, having clearly watched our interaction from across the garden. She was in her bridal robe with her hair half done, but her eyes were laser-focused on me with undisguised hostility. "Mrs. Walsh," she said, her voice tight with controlled panic, "the vendors are saying there's some issue with payments. I need you to resolve this immediately." "The issue is simple," I replied calmly. "I'm not authorizing any further payments until we have a conversation about respect and family inclusion." "We already had that conversation," she snapped, dropping all pretense of politeness. "You lost. David chose me. Now stop sabotaging our wedding and release the payments." David looked back and forth between us with growing alarm. "What conversation? What's she talking about?" And that's when I realized that Brittany had never told David about our coffee shop meeting. She'd never shared her ultimatum about my choice to gracefully accept whatever role she assigned me or lose my son entirely. She'd managed the conflict without letting David see her true character. "David," I said quietly, "did Brittany tell you that she offered me alternative seating for your wedding ceremony? In the garden terrace, outside the actual venue?" His face went blank with shock. "What? She suggested I watch your wedding from outside because there wasn't enough room for me inside with all the important people from her family." I watched understanding dawn across David's features as he turned to look at his fiancée. "Brittany, you said there were just some minor seating adjustments." "David, we don't have time for this conversation right now," Brittany said sharply. "We have guests arriving in 2 hours, and your mother is holding our vendors hostage. She needs to authorize the payments now." But David was no longer listening to her crisis management. He was staring at her with the expression of someone seeing clearly for the first time in months. "You tried to make my mother watch our wedding from outside." The moment of truth had finally arrived, and Brittany realized that her careful narrative control was collapsing. Her response would determine not just the fate of their wedding day, but the future of their relationship. What she said next would reveal everything. "David, you're being ridiculous." Brittany's voice carried a sharp edge I'd never heard before, desperation bleeding through her usual control. "There were logistical considerations that your mother is completely misrepresenting." But David was no longer accepting her explanations without question. "Logistical considerations? For my mother? At my wedding?" I could see the exact moment when months of subtle manipulation became visible to him. Every excluded family member, every cancelled tradition, every time Brittany had spoken for him in conversations I wasn't invited to join. It was all connecting in his mind like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was solving. "David, we need to focus on the immediate problem," Brittany continued, her voice rising with panic. "Your mother is sabotaging our wedding day with these payment games. Make her stop." The phrase, "make her stop," hung in the air like a revelation. After almost a year of carefully managing David's perceptions, Brittany had finally revealed her true expectation, that he would control his mother's behavior to ensure her comfort. "Make her stop," David repeated slowly. "Brittany, she's my mother. She's not some problem for me to manage. She's been a problem since the day we met." The words exploded out of Brittany before she could stop them, her composure finally cracking under the stress of her perfect day falling apart. "She's possessive and controlling, and she's never accepted that you've outgrown your little hometown family dynamics." The mask was completely off now, and everyone within earshot, including several of her bridesmaids and Dr. Chen, could hear exactly what Brittany really thought about David's family. "Outgrown." David's voice was quiet but dangerous. "What exactly do you think I've outgrown?" Too late, Brittany realized she'd revealed too much, but the damage was already done, and in her panic, she doubled down instead of backing away. David, you're brilliant and ambitious, and you deserve a sophisticated life with people who understand your potential. But your mother keeps trying to pull you back into these small-minded family obligations that don't serve your growth. I watched my son's face as he processed what his fiancée was really saying. That loving his family was somehow limiting his potential. That maintaining relationships with people who had supported him his entire life was small-minded. That choosing loyalty over ambition was a character flaw to be corrected. Small-minded family obligations, he repeated. Like having dinner with my mother once a month, like inviting Uncle Frank to my wedding, like including the people who raised me in the most important day of my life. David, you're being emotional. We can discuss this later. No. His voice was firm in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager, standing up to bullies. We're discussing this now, because apparently there are things about your feelings toward my family that I need to understand before I marry you. By now, the entire wedding party had gathered around us, drawn by Brittany's raised voice and the obvious tension. Dr. Chen looked mortified that her daughter's careful composure had cracked so publicly. The bridesmaids stood frozen, unsure whether to support Brittany or distance themselves from the developing scene. But it was David's groomsmen who provided the most telling reactions. These were friends who had known him since college, who had watched his gradual transformation over the past year. I could see recognition in their faces. They were finally witnessing the source of changes they'd noticed but hadn't understood. Brittany, David continued, his voice growing stronger. Did you really think my mother should watch our wedding from outside? Cornered and desperate, Brittany made the fatal mistake of trying to justify her position instead of apologizing for it. David, your mother has been difficult throughout this entire planning process. She's questioned every decision, tried to change arrangements that were already finalized, and now she's literally holding our vendors hostage on our wedding day. At some point, you have to choose between enabling her controlling behavior and protecting our relationship. The ultimatum was out in the open now. Choose between his mother and his fiancée. But Brittany had miscalculated David's response. Instead of feeling pressured to choose her, he was finally seeing the impossible position she'd been putting him in for months. Controlling behavior. David's voice was getting louder now, his own emotions breaking through. She's been paying for $60,000 of our wedding while being excluded from planning it. She's been systematically cut out of every decision about a celebration she's funding. And when she finally tries to have a voice in the process, you call it controlling. She's trying to manipulate you with money. Or maybe she's trying to be included in her son's life. The argument was escalating beyond anything that could be smoothed over or explained away later. Guests were starting to arrive and witness the bride and groom shouting at each other in the garden, while vendors stood around wondering whether there would actually be a wedding to cater. Dr. Chen finally stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation with damage control. Perhaps we should all take a breath and discuss this privately. No, David said firmly. I'm done with private discussions where my mother gets blamed for problems she didn't create. I'm done with being told that loving my family is a character flaw I need to outgrow. He turned to face Brittany directly, and I could see the boy I'd raised finally reasserting himself after months of being told he needed to become someone else. Brittany, I need you to answer one question honestly. Do you respect my family? Do you respect the people who raised me and the values they taught me? The question hung in the air like a final exam she'd been preparing for all year. Everything depended on her answer, not just the wedding, but any possibility of a future together. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and calculated. I respect the people you're becoming, David. I don't respect the limitations others try to place on your potential. It was the wrong answer. Completely, devastatingly wrong. David stared at her for a long moment, and I could see years of manipulation and gradual isolation finally crystallizing into clarity. The woman he'd planned to marry had just told him that she didn't respect the foundation of who he was. "Then this conversation is over," he said quietly. And just like that, the wedding was off. The aftermath of a cancelled wedding is a unique kind of chaos. Guests continued arriving for the first hour, unaware that the celebration had imploded until they encountered clusters of confused family members and frantic whispered conversations. The vendors stood in professional limbo, unsure whether to continue setup or begin breakdown while waiting for someone with authority to give them direction. Dr. Chen attempted damage control with military precision, speaking in urgent undertones to her relatives while shooting pointed glares in my direction. Several of Brittany's friends tried to comfort her as she alternated between furious tears and demands that David stop being ridiculous and proceed with the ceremony. But David had walked away from the argument and retreated to a quiet corner of the gardens, needing space to process the collapse of his year-long engagement. I found myself in the strange position of being both the catalyst of the day's destruction and the only person with the authority to resolve the vendor situation. Patricia from the catering company approached me hesitantly, clearly unsure how to handle the unprecedented situation. "Mrs. Walsh, we need guidance about the reception setup. Should we continue with dinner preparations or—" "Continue with dinner," I said, without hesitation. "Anyone who's here can stay and eat. Consider it a celebration of honesty." It took another hour for David to seek me out. I was sitting on a bench near the rose garden, watching late-arriving guests receive the news that there would be no ceremony, but they were welcome to join an impromptu reception. Some left immediately, but surprisingly, many stayed. Perhaps they were curious about the drama, or maybe they were simply hungry after getting dressed up for a wedding. "Mom," David said quietly, sitting beside me on the bench, "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For letting it get this far, for not seeing what was happening, for almost choosing someone who thought so little of the people who love me." I reached over and took his hand, squeezing gently. "You don't need to apologize for falling in love with someone who presented herself differently than she really was. That's not your fault." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the organized chaos of a wedding reception without a wedding. Uncle Frank and Aunt Linda had arrived during the confrontation and stayed for the aftermath, and I could see them talking with some of David's college friends near the catering station. People were adaptable, it turned out. Take away the ceremony, and they simply treated it as an unusually expensive cocktail party. "What happens now?" David asked. "Now you figure out who you want to be when someone isn't telling you that you need to outgrow yourself." I feel like I don't know anything anymore. Like this whole year was some kind of fever dream where I became a person I don't recognize. "You're still the same person, David. You just got convinced that you needed to be someone else to deserve love. But real love doesn't require you to abandon the people and values that made you who you are." Brittany appeared across the garden, having changed out of her bridal robe into a cocktail dress. She was surrounded by her bridesmaids and Dr. Chen, all of them shooting pointed looks in our direction. I could see her building up to one final attempt at salvaging the situation. "David," she called out as she approached our bench, "we need to talk privately." David looked at her with exhausted eyes. "I think we've said everything we need to say. You're making a mistake. You're letting your mother manipulate you into throwing away our entire relationship." No, Brittany. I'm finally seeing our relationship clearly. And what I see is someone who wanted to remake me into her ideal partner while eliminating everyone who might remind me of who I used to be. That's not true. You tried to exclude my mother from our wedding ceremony. You removed my uncle and aunt from the guest list because they weren't sophisticated enough. You systematically eliminated every family tradition that mattered to me. And when I ask you if you respect the people who raised me, you tell me you only respect who I'm becoming under your influence. Brittany's composure was cracking again, revealing flashes of the desperation underneath. David, every relationship requires compromise. I was helping you grow. You were isolating me. There's a difference. Dr. Chen stepped forward, attempting to mediate. David, perhaps with some counseling, you and Brittany could work through these communication issues. Dr. Chen, David said politely but firmly, the issue isn't communication. The issue is that your daughter doesn't respect my family and sees my love for them as a limitation she needs to help me overcome. That's not something counseling can fix. It was over, and everyone knew it. Brittany made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. Fine, she said, her voice cold and sharp. But don't come crawling back when you realize what you've thrown away. Don't call me when you're stuck in your small town mentality and wondering what your life could have been. David stood up slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a confidence I hadn't heard in months. Brittany, I hope you find someone who thinks loving their family is a character flaw that needs correction. But that person isn't me, and it never was. Thus she left then, taking her entourage with her. Dr. Chen paused long enough to give me a look that suggested she held me personally responsible for the destruction of her daughter's perfect day, but she didn't say anything. Sometimes silence speaks louder than accusations. The impromptu reception continued for several more hours. Without the formal structure of a wedding celebration, it became something more authentic. Groups of people who cared about David gathering to support him through a difficult day. Uncle Frank regaled David's friends with fishing stories. Aunt Linda helped the caterers serve food to anyone who wanted it. Sarah Martinez, my best friend who hadn't been invited to the original wedding, showed up after hearing about the situation and spent the evening making sure David knew he was surrounded by people who loved him exactly as he was. As the sun set over the botanic gardens, David and I found ourselves alone again, sitting at one of the elegantly set tables that would never host the dinner they were designed for. Do you think I made the right choice? He asked. I think you made the only choice that honored who you really are. It's going to take me a while to figure out how to trust my own judgment again. That's okay, you have time, and you have people who love you enough to be patient while you remember who you are when someone isn't trying to change you. We sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the expensive remnants of a celebration that never happened. The flowers were still beautiful, the tables still elegant, the garden still perfect for a wedding. But instead of celebrating David's commitment to someone who wanted to remake him, we were celebrating his commitment to remaining himself. It wasn't the day any of us had planned, but it might have been exactly the day David needed to remember that love shouldn't require you to outgrow the people who helped you grow up. Sometimes the most important celebrations are the ones that never actually happen. 6 months later, David would meet Sarah, a veterinarian who loved that he called his mother every Sunday and insisted on hosting Uncle Frank's annual visit. Their wedding was small, held in my backyard, with every important person in David's life getting a front row seat to his happiness. But that's a different story entirely.